One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory, glory. Oh.
I wish to apply for acceptance as a participant in course Freedom Ride, 1961.
To travel via bus from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, Louisiana, and to test and challenge segregated
facilities en route. I understand that I should be participating in a nonviolent protest
against racial discrimination, that arrest or personal injury to me might result.
The Freedom Rides of 1961 were an integral part of the civil rights movement, but it is one of the least told stories of the time. A group of 13 people, 6 black and 7 white, set off on a Greyhound bus across the South to test the state's compliancy with the Virginia v. Boyd Supreme Court case that desegregated all forms of public transportation. This case allowed blacks and whites to ride together, which sounds great, but Southern states weren't complying. Segregation was still eminent in every other public sphere besides transportation, which is why Southerners were so prejudiced to the Freedom Riders, a prejudice that would then lead to violence.
It was all-encompassing, this so-called Southern way of life, would not allow for any breaks. It was a system that was only as strong, the white Southerners thought, as its weakest link. So you couldn't allow people even to sit together on the front of a bus, something that really shouldn't have threatened anyone, but it did. It threatened their sense of the wholeness, the sanctity of what they saw as an age-old tradition.
In order for the trip to be successful, everything needed to be perfectly planned out to ensure the safety of the riders. The journey was set to begin on May 4th, 1961 in Washington, D.C., and pass through Richmond, Virginia, Greensboro, North Carolina, Rock Hill and Columbia, South Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery, Alabama, Jackson, Mississippi, and was projected to end in New Orleans, Louisiana on May 17th. Due to the violence and chaos that followed the riders at every stop, they were never able to reach Louisiana, and the rides ended in Parchman, Mississippi on May 25th.
Martin Luther King was the most prominent leader of the civil rights movement, but he did not fully support the Freedom Rides. However, when the riders were barricaded in Alabama, he played a significant role in strategizing while they were in Dr. Richard Harris's mansion. Years later, he worked with leaders that had emerged from the Freedom Rides on campaigns such as the March on Washington, the Selma Marches, and all events that led to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
They had hopes not only to meet Dr. King, but maybe he would become a Freedom Rider, that he'd get on those buses with them. But he pulled some of the leaders of the Freedom Ride aside and said, look, I hear some pretty disturbing things from my sources in Alabama. The Alabama Klan is preparing quite a welcome. And furthermore, many people in the movement think what you're doing may do more harm than good. King said, I'm not going to get on the buses with you, and if I were you, I probably wouldn't go into Alabama.
Despite King's advice, the riders continued through the Deep South. Some Southerners believed it was still wrong to mix races and completely ignored the new law. Once the riders set off on their journey, they were immediately met with conflict and resistance by counter-protesters, police, and the Ku Klux Klan. The driver of the bus called on the police, who called Klansmen and organized an attack on the bus.
When the riders came to Alabama, they were greeted by several members of the KKK. The Klansmen attempted to end the rides by firebombing the bus and killing everyone inside. Luckily, the gas tank exploded, causing the people who were holding the bus doors shut to run away and giving those trapped inside a way out. After the attack, no one made an effort to call an ambulance, no license plates were taken, and no witnesses were questioned. This was a display of the complacency of the government when it came to hate crimes in the South.
At what point were you, when you were on that bus, did you think, this is serious and we may die?
When the mob had pretty much broken out most of the windows. They were trying to get into the door, but fortunately for us, when the bus driver got off of the bus he locked the door so they couldn't get inside. So for a moment, I thought we were safe. I knew if I got off the bus, I knew the mob would kill me.
How old were you at the time?
19.
19.
And they were yelling, we're gonna kill these niggas. And so I had that particular choice. If I stayed on the bus, and frankly, I decided to, at that point, to commit suicide.
Really?
It was just a question of how I was gonna die. I knew I was gonna die. So I thought that if I breathed in the smoke, took a big deep breath of the smoke, it would put me to sleep, and that's the way I would die. So I decided to do that. And when I did, of course, the involuntary actions of your body takes over, and you try to fight for air. So ran up to the front of the bus, and the people outside were holding the bus door when they saw that we were trying to get off. And I could hear them saying, "Let's burn them niggas alive. They're trying to get off the bus." And at that moment, the fuel tank in the back of the bus exploded. And when it exploded, everybody ran, the ones outside. And that's the only way we were able to get off of that bus.
A great change is at hand. And our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality.
The 1960s were a very demanding time for President Kennedy. Along with racial inequality, we were also dealing with the Cold War, which took precedent. He used his campaign as a pro-civil rights platform, and when writers were in need, he sent U.S. Marshals to their aid, but his administration did allow the writers to be imprisoned on fallacious terms. After the Freedom Rides were over, Kennedy gave a speech to Congress pushing to pass the Civil Rights Act. Unfortunately, he never got to see it pass because he was assassinated in November of 1963.
It was America. It was interracial. It was interregional. It was secular and religious. It brought together people of different political philosophies. There was a sense of unity and purpose that I'm not sure that the movement ever had before. It was a shining moment.
Now the matter is before the ICC. We have taken action in the government to try to end segregation in all of these facilities. It seems to me that that's the proper place for it to be. I don't see that the Freedom Riders now, who are so-called Freedom Riders, who are making these trips, accomplish a great deal. I question their wisdom. I don't question their legal right to travel, but I question their wisdom. I think that some people can get hurt, innocent people that don't have anything to do with it.
The journey of the Freedom Riders is one of great treachery, but their hard work and dedication paid off. After the end of the rides, Robert Kennedy convinced the Interstate Commerce Committee to revamp the Supreme Court case with further specifications to make sure nothing like this would ever have to happen again. Dr. King continued to fight for civil rights and delivered his I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington, where Freedom Rider John Lewis also spoke. 3 years later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which outlawed racial discrimination, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory voting processes, which in turn outlawed segregation in general. The riders stood for what they believed in, regardless of the backward they would receive, and their service to this country will never be forgotten. The road was tough, but the riders were tougher, and due to their strength and willingness to sacrifice, they changed America.